We saw in the previous session already some collaborations with Portugal, with Belgium, with Slovenia. There was already collaboration with the public sector, the institutions and academia. And now we really focus more from the perspective of academia. And the next 1.5 hours, we have really I'm very happy and very excited that we have three super scientists, I would say, among us, academics. Dr. Marijn Janssen from Delft University of Technology. We have also Ines Mergel from Konstanz University. And last but not least, Vassilis Kouliolas from the eGovlab, Sweden, Stockholm University. So I would like to give the first floor to the first speaker, Professor Marijn Janssen, who is full professor ICT in governance and also chair of ICT group of the Technology, Policy and Management faculty, a long list, of the Delft University of Technology. His research is focused on ICT architecting and design science in situations in which public and private organizations need to collaborate together, which is a real challenge, and in which ICT enables them. Also, it's also good to inform you that Professor Marijn Janssen is also a guest professor here in Leuven, which we are very happy about it. And last but not least, I really look forward to your presentation.
Is defined. Let me just write that down here.
Thank you, Joep, for the kind introduction for that. I was a little bit surprised about that. I was thinking today about my PhD. It's a long time ago, almost 20 years ago I finished my PhD, and I was doing neural networks at the time. I was building a system for neural networks, and now we're talking about AI and innovation about that. So I was a bit puzzled over there. What do we mean with the AI? And often what we talk about nowadays is narrow AI, so very small view on AI, and we spend billions on that, on what we already know. So I'm already a bit struggling from what we are really looking for. And when we look at my university, then AI is in every department. We have maritime technique, we have mechanical engineering, we have civil engineering. AI techniques are everywhere with that, and they are educated by the students, and the students already know it. So my main question with that is, what do we really understand in innovation? And innovation is also in the eye of the beholder. Innovation is for whom it is innovation, and for which scale it's innovation, and which extent is innovation with that. And what we often neglect to do is that we have to understand that's already a lot of expertise in certain areas. And with innovation, we often neglect those expertise. We talked today also, one of the questions was about it, how to connect the expertises together. That's one of the issues in public sector innovation with that. So I'm not sure if we should talk about innovation for that. The second one, and that's why I deleted it over there. We talk often about public sector innovation for that, and I want to plead that we shouldn't talk about public sector innovation, because we're innovating the digital society, we're innovating together with businesses, with universities, with other knowledge organizations with that. So we should talk about public innovation, but not about public sector innovation, because that suggests there's a focus on a certain sector, and even you can remove the public when you think about it, and you can remove also the innovation part of it. But what is very important to understand is that interoperability is more important and necessary than even in the past. Because we started with the basics, we have some authentic registries and those kind of things, we have some of the basic layers of the data, but we're collecting more and more data nowadays. With the Internet of Things, we collect massive amounts of data. We have an experimental environment in Delft where we collect a lot, gigabytes of data a second about the behavior, about the use, and we're measuring almost everything in that part, even simple things as temperature. We're moving to 5G, and 5G enables us to measure it from anywhere. So we don't have to worry about our fiber or whatever. We can use 5G about it. The conditions that we have a good network with that. Then we have use a lot of data analytics for making sense of that data. But we often don't know what's the data. And there's also what interoperability comes in. We often try to talk about explainable AI, but without interoperability, no explainable AI with that, because you don't know the semantic interoperability. If you want to explain something, the base is the data you need to do it. So interoperability becomes more and more important for that. And what makes it so difficult with that? Interoperability in the past, we could focus on one single domain. But nowadays, because we're connecting all the data together, it's not a single domain, it's always cross domains. We have different standards, we might have different approaches to interoperability, and we have to connect those domains together. And that makes it also quite hard from that. Then we are connecting all the countries together, and also the countries, they have developed their own siloed approaches that are part of it, and that makes it even more complicated with that. And then all the innovations are almost all cross-domain, and not within a certain domain, not within a certain given service or something like that, but it's outside the domain. And that makes it also very complicated with that. And we don't have a good starting point. In the past, with public services, we could take a public service as a starting point. Nowadays, we don't have the service as a starting point. So even our starting point vanishes and goes away with that. And then we look at the problems with innovations. I don't know, you might be familiar with it. We always have the obvious problems with innovations for that. The ambition changes over time. We have currently an ambition that will be different in a year from now. It will be different in a couple of years. The business models, the revenue models, how we deal with it will change over time for sure. Then there's too high complexity. The complexity we want to handle is too much. We spend a lot of money on it. The reason for that is because we want to do everything at the same time. But we also know from experience that we shouldn't do that, because innovation materializes a little bit bottom up, it comes at it, and a lot of money might also block innovation for that. So we have to think about a very smart way of dealing with it. Then often there's no user involvement in innovation. Why? The user doesn't want it. Remember the iPhone? Nobody wanted an iPhone. Already Oracle tried it, Microsoft tried it. They didn't want to have an iPhone at that time. You have to be at the right time, and users have to understand it. So it's quite hard to focus and involve the users. We lack expertise, of course, but expertise is everywhere. That's also the problem with that. And when I look at public sector innovation, we have a lot of public sector innovation, very fragmented with that, everywhere with it. We're doing a lot with that without any good focal points, and we tend to do the same thing over again. We take the same steps over again. Then there's a lot of proven technology, especially with AI. There's a lot of proven technology already with those kind of things. My students, they can do the programming within a couple of days with that. So often with innovation, you want to innovate, but you want also to keep some of the parts stable. That's part of the success. If you do all things dynamic at the same time, you will not succeed. There are too many uncertainties that are part with it. And then the technology and environment is changing at the same time. Then we have a lot of things that are incident driven. We have an incident, we have an event, and we want to solve it over there. Then all parties want to have a say, because innovation is important with that. Well, what happens when all parties have a say? We don't progress, we're stuck because we're just only talking about it, and we have always a catch-22 situation between legislation, institutional environment, and the technology with that. What should change first? How should we proceed with that? So that makes it quite hard to have any public sector innovation for that. So What is needed? Well, we discussed it already this morning, a focal point. We need to share our expertise together with that. Another one is innovation goes beyond the government. That's why I don't like to talk about public sector innovation or government innovation. It's never the government on its own. It's always with all kinds of other institutes that are part with it. And the problem also with innovation in the government is that there are a lot of bad dependencies. There are already all kinds of structures that are part of it, systems that block the innovation. So the government is not a really good environment for innovation because they focus on keeping the things in a solid way. Stability is the focus of the governments with that. And that's very important to keep that stability. Nobody wants to have a changing government all the time with instability. It's one of the core values that we should do and we should foster, and they're always a little bit conflicting with innovations with that. And we need to mobilize a lot of expertise for that. I remember in the Netherlands we had a lot of blockchain projects with that. They were funded with that. Let 1,000 flowers grow strategy with that. And a lot of those projects you could see at the start. Why did we do it? Nice for the people to learn the program in blockchain with that, but really the innovation, the real challenges, they were not addressed with that. Why? Because we didn't focus on the expertise that are part of it. Each project should focus on a certain challenge, and together they should make a difference with that. And a lot of those projects, they were already failures from the start for that. Then we want to be result-oriented because it's innovation. You have a certain vision. You want to show it. You want to accomplish a dream. Not in 10 years. You want to accomplish it next week. Don't wait too long. And then we have the interdisciplinary nature with that. That also makes it very difficult because different disciplines together. What happens when different disciplines come together? They clash. They can't talk together. They don't understand each other with that. Governments, academia, also disciplines within academia, they're not able to talk with each other. They have different communities, different languages, different focus with that. And nevertheless, innovation originates from that class. So that class is important. We need that class to have it. So we need to combine different approaches. We need to define different cultures together. We need to combine different ideas. That's the whole essence of innovation, is that we have that class. So it makes it difficult, challenges, but we need it with that. So we need to combine the classes together. And when we zoom in a little bit, we see a lot of tensions with public sector innovation. First of all, the policy level and the execution level. They often don't understand each other. They criticize each other, they don't understand it. One influences the other. That might also result in failure. This is a typical tension with that. The ambidexterity, innovation versus exploration is part of it. Then there's a tension between the government and the market. The market is going a direction, they already have a solution, but the government does not listen to the solution because they can't procure it, because they have an open procurement process, or they're not allowed to exchange any knowledge with that due to the regulations with that. That's also a class over there that makes it very difficult to do. Then we have always the tension between the execution and the services with that. Often we are organized as a government in a very siloed way. We do it for a reason. Those silos are important. I'm not saying that they should be removed or whatever, because the silos take care of certain concerns, and those concerns are very important. But we need an integral approach. I remember yesterday morning, the people were joking about many one-stop shops. Yes, that is this one about. There's a reason why there's so many one-stop shops, but we need really an integral approach with that. But at the same time, the agencies should focus on their concerns. That's what they are doing, and they're good at. So we should have something in between. And then we have a huge problem with the use of knowledge with that. All the parties fragmented have part of the puzzle.
Is really this.
And it's a big puzzle with that. Everybody together, we have all the knowledge. No problem over there. I'm sometimes joking about it. We have everything in-house. Even the government within the government probably has all the knowledge. Because there's so many smart people within the government for doing it. And still, we're not able to use that knowledge and to use it. So what we should is move from a fragmented to a coherent landscape. That's what we want to do. We want to have all the parties together. We want to have a class together. We want to collaborate together with that. And that's how we should also approach public sector innovation for that. We should have it together. And then I don't have a promotional video, but you can look at the website with that. Everybody has some videos nowadays with that. The DigiCampus was founded for that purpose. So where the companies, NL Digital in the Netherlands, governments, Ministry of Interior, the ICTU, the ICT Uitvoerings Execution Organization, and Logius, the Control and Maintenance Organization, and TU Delft works together. So all the parts, they work together to innovate it with that. In the middle nowadays our ministry with that. And we look at the helix for the 4 areas, including citizens with that. That should be on the table. And to innovate the public sector with that. And what we want to have in that sense is a sandbox. And what's a sandbox? Playing with the building blocks. SMEs, small and medium enterprises, they want to play with the building blocks because they want to ensure that the products fit within the environment. We want to play with the building blocks because we want to innovate with that and come with some new kind of applications in it. Governments want to play with the building blocks. They want to ensure that their new services will work within the current buildings blocks with that. And you want to have a focal point of expertise. So the 4 areas, they work together and they were brought together in various ways. I won't go into details about construction with that, but what's important is that there's an innovation hub and that also looks at the type of expertise and the focal points and also ensures that you retain the expertise. So if you have something new and somebody is coming with a challenge, that you know from, oh, we already solved this, but we didn't solve that. That you can each time take a next step, build upon the shoulders of each other. That's what we do also in research, that's what we also want to do with innovation part of it. And how do you want to do it? Well, using all kinds of design sprints, getting results within a very short time, preferably a couple of days. And the 4 groups, citizens, businesses, academia and governments are involved in each of those kind of things with that. So what you're doing with those design sprints is with that, but first day you're challenged a little bit, what is the real problem? Because often we have no clue about what's the real problem which we should address, the societal problem and not the technical problem with that. Often we have the solutions, but we want to know the real problem that a part of it. We want to have different experts involved, and often there are 8, 9, sometimes 12 people are involved in those design sprints with that. You want to have user feedback during the design sprint, so also the users are involved in one way or another, because you want immediately feedback, and at the end you want to have a running prototype that is part of it within those 5 days. And I want to give you some examples of that, what was done using those design sprints. One, first of all, a game was developed. Why was a game developed with that? To ensure that people, public servants, encountered the problems of the citizens, to mimic what it was. We're talking about integral service provision, but they have no clue what was encountered with that. So let them face it, not by doing it real, but by playing the game. Let them show the frustration of that. Let them get frustrated themselves with that within the 5 days. Another example was within the 5 days a working prototype of a system that is able to detect people who might get a debt. So they have social security, they have loans and those kind of things. Their debt is growing and growing, and at the end they might come up within real problems with that. They can't pay the debt anymore. They have to leave their house or something like that. Really painful situations with that. So we were able to do using a privacy enhancement mechanism and those kind of things. We were able to detect possibilities for people who might get into problems. Always a risk with those kind of things. We know the statistics. Data might be right, but might be wrong also. But it can help also to prevent it. So it's preventive with that. We had a pilot of a prototype with communication with Social Security. People there are very uncertain who have social security, so they make a lot of phone calls with that. You don't want to have those phone calls. The problem is that they are uncertain. You want to ensure that they're not uncertain anymore, so you want to have proactive communication with that. So instead of waiting till they call and ask you all kinds of questions, you already provide the answers to them. Another one with that. Well, we're talking about open systems, open ecosystems, so we also developed APIs for our open banking. And why is that important? Because you want to use the financial information from banks, pension funds, and those kinds of things combined with the financial information from the government, because that's the only way that you can provide citizens with a complete picture of their finance that are part of it. And of course, there was also some blockchain self-sovereign identity with that to make a prototype of identity management and information wallet with that, among others with that. I don't want to give you more, but I hope that what I want to convince you about is in this. From what we're moving towards is a situation that demands much more interoperability, and especially semantic interoperability, because we have those huge amount of data. We can come up with explainable AI with all kinds of mechanisms, but if we don't know the meaning of the data, it stops. Interoperability is the essence, and we all too often neglect that in all kinds of AI projects with that. We need to collaborate with that, so no public sector innovation, so public innovation with a lot of sectors with that. Then the 4 areas need to be presented to do it really quickly, to get user feedback very quickly, but also get companies involved, because companies often already have solutions. There are immense amount of entrepreneurs. I was not aware of that, but there are thousands of entrepreneurs and small companies who provide all kinds of solutions already that else need to be developed over there. Mobilize them. The sandbox with the building blocks is very important to have it ready, to be able to configure, try out new solutions with that. Well, tomorrow we talked about infrastructure. This is something similar. If you don't have it ready, you can't prototype, you can't experiment, and you need to make it tangible. If you don't make it tangible, if people don't see it, they don't understand it with that. So you really have to experience with that. You have to retain the knowledge with that, and then please don't forget that the roles of the partners involved in such collaboration, they change over time and per area. So each time we have a design sprint, we have to think about who will be involved, who has the right knowledge about that, and that could also be partners that were not the founding partners of this initiative, that could also be outside it with that. So each time you want to take a step with that. So I hope we don't talk about sector anymore, but about integration about that, and we have to rethink about what we really think about innovation, and I hope this gives some clues about the failures, about the potential solution and directions for that. And then this morning there was somebody asking from, oh, we should combine every layers together. Yes, but I completely agree with that. It's also risky. Innovation, too many people on the table, innovation will fail with that. That's a huge risk. So you have to balance that, get the right expertise in it, given a problem. There might be other questions, but I hope you have a basic understanding of what I'm heading for, and questions can always be directed by email also if it's later, but there might be questions now.
Thank you very much. And what I take from this presentation is,
since that new basis is an orthonormal
innovation.
compute each of these coordinate vectors using inner products. And again, these inner products all depend simply on this angle theta. Or in fact, some of the inner products do not depend at all. For example, the inner product of EY and EY prime is simply equal to 1, because Y does not change. I rotate only.
Hello. First of all, I find your input really, really valuable. But I wanted to ask whether you see any willingness from the government side to adopt your research findings as a form of advice, like if you can influence their decisions in a way. I mean, if they come to you to ask for advice from what you can. What you find? Like,
for sure.
Yeah.
Government is a founding partner of it. I'm on the right with that. NL Digital is next to me. Our Minister of Interior is in the middle with that. Logius, the director, is on the left of our ministry, and ICTU is on the complete left. So it's government with that. The only one missing in this picture is society with that. And what I'm always saying, we all are society with that. It's quite difficult to represent society to the public. So sometimes you look for the ombudsman, sometimes you look for a representation in another form with that. So that's the major difficulty. But the governments for sure listen, because they are founding fathers with that, and they want to have that. Because they know we have to take those steps with that. And we know we're researching for decades, of course. And I'm so happy with that, that I finally can get my expertise into practice for that.
Same thing as before, if we want to compute the transformation matrix from the old to the new basis.
Thank you. Are there other questions in the audience?
Coordinate vectors, we can do that by computing inner products, since we're working with an orthonormal basis. And again,
No other questions?
Can be computed based on what we know.
We will wait. We have time, so...
So again, these inner products only depend on the angle of the rotation here.
Yes?
This angle has been chosen to be a specific value here.
Yeah. You mentioned that you're trying to attract, you identified, you work also with SME startups, etc. How did you approach them? How did you find them? Because this is something we're interested in as well.
That's always having a high complexity with that. Well, our trick is to involve NL Digital, with its the association of software vendors. So they have about 600 organizations that are part of them. That's one way of connecting it. But we also have two locations with that. One in the entrepreneur location,
by writing this transformation
so close to the
as a product.
The reason for that is that if you take coffee, you might meet them at the coffee machine and you start discussing it. So there's also a trick with that. A lot of incubators, they work like that. And also in Delft we have a large incubator with that, which is quite technical often with that, even two types of incubators, yes Delft, with also a lot of organizations, but there are many more with that, of course. So you have to mobilize them based on that. But you can also make a kind of call sometimes. If you address a problem, we have a call and people pop up. It's like organizing a hackathon with that. I did it, we also organized hackathons. I didn't give that example over here because I guess it's quite common for doing it. I prefer the design sprints because then you get it more focused. But hackathon, then they compete the companies also to show their solutions. So we had also a blockchain hackathon with all the companies, and they provided all kinds of blockchain solutions with that. But what you see often with a hackathon, that's what I find disadvantage with that, they focus on the user interface at the end, and you don't know what's really on the back with that. So then you, at the end, the jury, they make an assessment with that, but you don't really know what it is. And then at the later stage, we looked into it, and you think, yeah, we might have to make the wrong decision with awarding the right one, because on the back is it different than what they present on the user interface. It's also not easy. I'm not saying it's easy here. I'm not saying this is a solution for everything with that, but it can be used to overcome some of the challenges. And each time we have to think about how to do it. So also with the involvement of the SMEs and entrepreneurs for that.
Thank you, Marijn. One last question.
Professor Kenneth from the Pioneer Program. I just wanted to ask, and also to tie back from the previous panel, there's a lot of interest from the government itself in developing its own innovations in-house, as in like they create their own solutions. So what do you think? Should the government be focusing on developing its own innovative solutions using AI or big data in-house, or should they be focusing on creating an ecosystem, creating sufficient enablers, creating sufficient funding for the private sector to actually contribute towards the space, to create innovations in public policy through open source data, through making more resources available and things like that. What do you think should be the government's priorities?
Yeah, the two things, what I think and what's actually done over here. Well, that's why I took this picture. I didn't explain it in detail with that, but this is of course an ecosystem. So it's an open ecosystem approach with that, and simply as that, from if we do something with that, it's always open source as standard with that. If something is developed in it, the IP is also open intellectual property to ensure that, but of course, the market, you won't want to interfere with the markets with that. They should come up with the final scalable solutions and those kind of things. So the market should come up with proposals with that. This is a little bit before actually and doing in a large scale. You can see it also for defining the real requirements, what you want, how it should look like, and then involve everybody. So you have a level playing field. And then you can outsource it as a next step to the market with that. So please, government should not do it internally, I think, because that's a recipe for disaster, one of the failure factors with that. But it's also a recipe for disaster if you don't do it together, because then you buy something that doesn't match with that. I think we're on the same page, are we? Yeah.
Thank you very much. With this, I would like to stop the contribution from Professor Janssen. I would like now to give the floor to Professor Mergel, but first I'm looking now to the PowerPoint. I think that's it, yes. So, yes, it's my honor to introduce you Dr. Ines Mergel, who is full professor of public administration in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Konstanz, Germany. She was previously on the public administration faculty at the Maxwell School of Citizen and Public Affairs of Syracuse University, where she earned the tenure of Associate Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs. Ines is an expert, a real expert in social media, and teaches courses in agile government, digital government, and social media in the public sector. I'm really excited and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. All right, hi everyone. So I will present first results of an EU-funded project that is called COVAL. My working package is on digital transformation. The other working packages are looking at social services, for example, and look at the direct interaction between citizens and service providers. In digital transformation, we are looking at digital service delivery as a whole process, and some of the questions that we have, at least in my working package, derived from a conceptual framework that is based on what Christian Gondrus has put forward, where he said, well, we should look at co-production, where we really involve citizens, the end users, in all stages, and so far we are looking really only at the provider sphere, where most of these tasks, design, development, manufacture, and delivery, are happening at the back office and not so much involving the actual users. This is something that we call the customer sphere, or where then users, internal, external users, are coming in and testing our projects or directly using it at that time. He calls that the value and use, when for the first time users are integrated. In the private sector it's oftentimes different, but in the public sector this is actually the model. And what Gondrus has pushed us forward to was that we should look at the full value creation, and so also include the back office. And this is what's happening right now also in government, with lots of the human-centered design activities that are coming in digital service teams, for example. So our main research question for this part of the deliverable was, how are public administrations co-producing public value in digital service delivery? So that ties a little bit into one of the questions that Pedro, I think, earlier received, where he tried to say, how do we measure what comes out? Are people actually satisfied, and are they using the services? So what is the actual value then? That was our question. And so our research design was based on initial expert interviews. We reached out to over 100 experts around the world, and then from there extracted a definition and tried to understand what the cases should be. This is mostly for the students who have to do this type of work as well later on. So we used a cross-case analysis of multiple cases. They all had a very similar setup and were comparable, and then synthesized those findings, was then trying to predict what is similar about them. So what are similar activities that we see that the units are using when they are working on digital service delivery? So one of the first results was that we were trying to define what even is digital transformation. Is this just a new word for e-government? Some people also use digital government and so on. So we, from those expert interviews, we derived our definition. You might want to use it or not. Basically, digital transformation is moving along a continuum. Some agencies are still at that stage where they're moving from analog to digital, which basically means you have a paper form, you're replicating that online, you're downloading it as a PDF, you fill it in on paper because you have to print it out at home. You walk it into the agency, and then they say, oh, this is an old form, let me just type it in for you. And so it's observing others, then civil servants do the service for you, offline, basically, but in front of you. And then moving on along that continuum, we have some agencies that are able to replicate the offline form, the analog form, into a digital form where you can actually type things in, and it's then transmitted to the agency. But what transformation then really is a full stack review of the policies, so the legal background, organizational processes connected to that, and then what is it that we need to accomplish. And that might not be the traditional service that we originally had, from the internal logic of how government or civil servants interpret rules and regulations and then implement a service. So the transformation then happens when there's a complete revision of an existing service, and we might even create new services. And hopefully the outcome is something like user satisfaction, maybe completely new forms, those public service innovations of service delivery, and the expansion of the user base. And that seems to be a very private sector term, because we are not really there to move into new markets, to abandon some of the people who are not adding to our bottom line or any of that. That's not what public service obviously is about. Instead, we are hoping that as we have more easy to use online services, people are able to use them and are not frequently coming in, are not asking out those questions where then civil servants have to say, oh, they don't just get it. They don't know how to fill out those forms, right? It needs to be easy enough so that people can use it. If you want to read more about this, there's a paper that I published in Marijn's journal where it's open access, so you can just download it. So what we have then extracted from there, when we talked to those experts, we wanted to understand where is this digital transformation happening. And you've seen some of those experts here this morning who are actually running those types of agencies. The teams are organizationally embedded at a very high level, usually right in the chancellor's or the president's office, most of the time their own agencies, and then using cross-functional ways on how to operate. I've written one paper on what these digital service teams are. At that point, I used different types of agencies. Some of the work I did in the US with US Digital Service 18F, the Canadian Digital Service, and so on. And for the stuff that we've done for the European Commission now, we used these types of digital service teams. You might recognize at least two. BOSA is here, or was here this morning. We also included the Team Digitale in Italy, and one of the students is here, is actually Maria Claudia is actually here from the Team Digitale, so if you want to talk to her. My work was focused on the government digital service in the UK, simply because there's nothing comparable to that in Germany, so I couldn't work with any Germans on that. I want to talk to you a little bit about what these teams are actually doing and how they are co-producing value. So I'm using the example of a government digital service in the UK. Organizationally embedded directly in the Cabinet Office, they're responsible for delivering services to all other agencies. Lots of money behind this at the beginning and lots of criticism why one agency now receives such a huge amount of money, but they are supposed to then scale it up to the rest of government. The reasons were interesting, so people actually were really fed up with the way that services were delivered. So it was an internal incentive, at the same time external also, that citizens are complaining. They usually do that, but because it's a monopolist, we oftentimes don't hear them. So then there was this anger inside government that internal users were simply not able to use the services that they had to deliver. Lots of modernization delays and so on. The mission was to come up with best practice guidance, sets for standards, and so on. Lots of these standards, you heard the digital playbook, for example, mentioned, are now replicated across all these other digital service teams by design. They're working in the open, everything is on the website, you can even download their tools and so on. And so across all the cases that I've worked on, GDS was the original team where then people replicated practices from. And this is an interesting way of looking at this. So what does the co-creation now look like? So how are citizens and users? So I should talk about users because for digital service teams, it's not always the end user, it's not always the citizen that's considered the user, but they are also obviously creating services for internal users, for other agencies who are then adapting that and using it for their own purposes. So what does this look like, the co-creation? Again, with the example of what GDS does in the UK, and there's lots of overlap to the others. So the first phase that's not really mentioned at all in the literature is the co-commissioning phase. You can derive this oftentimes from their mission statements where people say, you know, who was the minister who said we need to do these types of things or we need to invest into better social service delivery and so on. And they wanted to move toward government as a platform service. And the co-commissioning actors were other agencies. GDS itself was a very strong leader with Mike Bracken, who came from the Guardian at that time, where he had turned around a very traditional newspaper into a purely digital newspaper, only one that survived for a very long time without a paywall. And then a high-profile cabinet, the minister of the cabinet office, who pushed it along. And then co-design then happens where people in digital service teams are using really anthropological applications that we know from research that they are doing user research. They're talking to process owners. So on the content side, those people who are responsible for delivering the service, who know what the legal constraints are, what the regulations are, and then they're comparing that with user insights. So does it actually work the way that the process owner had designed it originally? And the results are, for example, user journeys. Here's the one from GDS, where you look at the pain points. So how did people start to look for a service? What were the next steps? Where did they run into walls or they had to get another signature and they couldn't move on? It was not automatically forwarded. Where did they had to pick up paperwork from literally next door or from another agency? For what reasons did they even come here? And how are the services connected to potentially other users than the one that the process owner originally thought about? And so people come up then with user journeys where you see, it's like a fever curve where you see where it was happy faces, where it was really negative, and then users are involved, and it's a very, it's really co-designed because it's not just IT service providers who are coming up with new requirements and then putting out a new service, but from day one, civil servants are involved, and then the users, whoever those users are, but also the IT providers, consultants potentially, and obviously citizens are a very essential part to this if it's an externally oriented service. The other activities in the next phase is the co-implementation or the management, co-management. that is usually mentioned in the literature, which usually happens in-house and not so much with users, but that's the phase where they're using user tests, usability tests. We all know this from the software industry, but we don't really know this in government usually. So co-implementation actors are then cross-agency groups who say, does this make sense? Is the interoperability there or not? Do we speak the same language? Can we actually exchange the data and so on? And then co-delivery, this is usually where we think when we talk about service delivery, where we think that citizens are coming in at this very late stage, usually. Everything else is a black box. All of a sudden we have a new tool or a software, and then we hope that people can use it. If not, we're changing a little bit, but at a very late stage, usually, users are coming in. And so here in the fourth phase, users are obviously part of it. They are delivering together, and this is the value in use. This is what the original concept had in mind. So it's not the latest stage, but it's where people then start to use the service, where they are submitting back user information, obviously, and we can then have feedback and change it. What has not been talked about in the literature at all, there's really no literature on this, is co-assessment. And I brought you here a live assessment form from GDS. They call it continuous service review. So continuous feedback that comes in through all phases, but especially when the service is live and you have opportunities to revise it and you are not waiting until you get the next round of funding for it, or you ignore what happens. So user statistics, obviously, it's a very passive way of getting feedback, but the active way is then this continuous feedback where people are reporting what's not working well. And this is also a way where citizens or users can then say, well, we actually need a completely different service, or maybe it wouldn't be nice to also connect this to another service. So moving, so you're registering your car, but then also moving that information directly to the insurance, for example, would be another add-on service. And if we are already online, why not create those linkages? So agencies and users are involved in this. And what I then came up with in these 5 phases, first of all, one of the accomplishments is that we have derived these 5 phases, and we now looked at what is the actual value that was then created in each of those phases. And this might be a bit academic, but maybe it gives you, for those of you who have to talk about this to their superiors or to government or parliament, to give you a bit of insight on what you could talk about. What is the actual value that is derived from these activities? So in the co-planning phase, the value is really democratic and societal value, that we are creating attention for what our user needs at a very, very early stage. So this is beyond what is in regulations or policies, but what is it that users actually need? So this push toward what is the service that we need, instead of how can we tweak the status quo incrementally, what is the completely new service, and how can we design this? So including this outside perspective makes it very democratic and societal in the sense that it's transparent, and we are avoiding this in-house bias. So in-house bias, with that I mean it's not a bad thing. Obviously every civil servant is doing their best, but what is important is to step away from this internal logic of we are not allowed to do this, we've always done it this way, and move your space. This is why the innovation labs are so important, right? To have these experimentation spaces and where people can freely think about completely new things. In the next phase, the co-design phase, values are relatively similar, so also democratic because it's transparent and inclusive, and inclusivity and access in this day and age also means that people no longer, if they're impaired, no longer have to actually physically go into a government agency. So that's a huge investment into accessibility that we haven't really thought about before. We've always said, well, but if they can't use digital services, we are leaving people behind. I think this is a very old statement in many ways, because most of the people are online, and we need to design the services in ways that they are simple enough so that really every generation can use them, and not make the hurdle or the administrative burden even higher. So craft solution with people, this value in exchange is then happening. And in the co-implementation phase, this is where we then come to things that might be of interest to Parliament, right? We talked about, can we reduce costs? We can't at this stage. I would take that out of your vocabulary right now, because it's all about the investment that was talked about earlier, and we have to invest millions, even billions of euros right now to get there. But you can derive economic value in the sense, or administrative value, that your procedures are easier, that people are willing to use your service, but that it's also speedier, that you're catering to them. You're avoiding failure. Failure in government, we talked about the white elephants yesterday, someone said that, right? So investments into platforms that no one is using is a huge failure in IT innovations. And if we are including the users much earlier, we might be able to avoid that type of failure. So bringing users where they actually want to use the service. So maybe cost reductions are possible, but probably not your main trigger point here. But in the co-delivery phase, it's all about citizen values. The actual seamless service consumption is a really, really important issue. Not having complaints is a huge advantage. So things that are not popping up in the press, where people are not complaining about your service, where it just works. We don't need 5 stars or any of that that Amazon would want us to have, that they have delivered a great service, but that we are delivering it to someone said at BOSA, I think the 75%. If that is the goal, then that is a very seamless way of creating citizen value. The last one, assessment, again, citizen and societal values, that we are avoiding unintended consequences, avoiding cost, and have those continuous updates and not waiting for huge revisions constantly, where we have to make huge investments, instead making incremental investments based on the feedback that we continuously receive. And so if I pull this together then as a last step and look at the theoretical framework again, I think it doesn't help us a lot here because the literature really talks only about the customer sphere, so the direct point of interaction, and that we need to shift our mindset to move interaction or co-production into all these different phases, and don't think that IT service providers or government have all the answers of how citizens want to use this. So if we want to extend the framework, then it should be looking much more simpler, something like this, where we have those different phases of co-production, where we see that all of this is the user sphere, and we are creating value in the whole process. Just a couple of words more on how this relates to the topic of this meeting here. So implementation challenges are not technologically related. That was one of my big eye-openers also yesterday when I saw the full interoperability framework. Interoperability to me is a very core IT term where we're trying to bring databases together to talk to each other, and I personally think we need to get out of that language and move toward the other layers that are also part of the framework. So legal interoperability is a much more important thing. You always run into people who constantly tell you, well, we are not allowed to do this, and then a good response is, well, show me in the law where it says we are not allowed to do this. And then people will start to scramble. So there's actually tons of things that you can do with the current laws. So it's in people's heads that there are legal challenges to that, and so I'm not even touching this. The other part is organizational interoperability, and I think this is has much more to do with cultural barriers, with the persistence of how we do things in government, and getting people into experimentation spaces is one way to kind of rattle them, but then they go back to their workplace and can't really apply those types of new things that they learn, right? They don't know how to move agile or do sprints with the manager who has never heard about this. So the scaling up then to the whole of government is one of the huge, huge challenges. So moving out of those innovation labs, out of digital service teams, and bringing all that great knowledge into a completely different dimension and moving it down the silos or across the silos is, I think, our biggest challenge. And this moving toward a digital mindset, we are not really there yet. I think people recognize it, that it's mainstreaming now, that it's not just the IT folks doing something, but that it's now, okay, maybe we also need to do something, but we don't have the money and so on. So rethinking services should come from a digital mindset. So this digital first mentality is when we have a new law, when we are rethinking a service, then think it from the digital point of view. That should be the starting point instead of saying, okay, where can we change the form a little bit? So not incrementally changing it. And so the cross-cutting issues that I discovered are really the lack of digital competencies. I have another paper, and I talked in the workshops a little bit about this. Again, this is, people didn't tell us that this is that you need to have programming knowledge or data science knowledge at every single civil servants shouldn't have those specialized professional skills. Instead, it's much more what kind of project management skills do you need to run these types of projects. And digital skills, competencies, it starts at the top. I always say the fish stinks from the head, right? And so if we don't have public managers who know the art of the possible, I think that's a really great quote of one of my interview partners. He said, if a public manager, so the head of an agency, the middle management, they don't know what's even possible and have the digital fluency to move between tools and maybe also switch easily, then they're lost. They're constantly bombarded with marketing material, what a CIO has to do next. Marijn pointed to the blockchain hype, right? We're, I think, at the bottom of it already. But then now every municipality thought they had to use blockchain or AI, and they simply don't have the skills. So this is for this, so I hope I gave you some insights on how these digital service teams work, and the paper is maybe coming out next year, we don't know. But we also have submitted it to the Commission, so hopefully it's open access at some point. Well, thank you.
Questions?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Joep, and I'm really glad that you touched upon legal interoperability, because actually this is my action under the Commission Interoperability Unit. And from your presentation, my impression was that you took law as granted, and the starting point was really the mission, the co-planning phase from a political level, let's say. My question is that have you or would you investigate the influence of this new co-design, co-production approach on the legal process and the lawmaking process? Because users may also bring new insights, and then do eventual legal barriers could be better addressed.
Yeah, so that was not part of this project, but obviously the whole participation literature and so on talks about this. And yeah, obviously we need to have very similar processes, I think, how we design legal, like rules, regulations, and so on. Lots of countries are working toward that. I mean, everyone is talking about the lean state, and they have some kind of unit that reviews new laws and says, you know, how can we make them simpler, and how are they not adding bureaucratic burden? And then we always usually have those delays that then those implementers, public servants, have to interpret what's in the law, and they might do it from a legal standpoint mostly instead of from a user standpoint. And I think that's the biggest challenge right now. So I come from a country where the civil service is purely trained in legal matters, but we don't have experts who are trained in user-centered design and those kinds of things. So that's our challenge, I think, yeah.
You happy with that? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Paola from Italy. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned project management skill set. My question is, which kind of approach do you recommend for co-creation? Agile approach, waterfall approach, something in between?
Well, waterfall, so for those who don't know the differences, maybe really quick. These are all terms from really the software industry, and waterfall means you have a large project, you're finishing one project phase first, you don't want to revisit it, you close it, and then you go to the next one, and at the end, after 10 phases, you maybe notice, well, maybe we should go back, or you fail. Big things happened during Obama's presidency when he switched on healthcare.gov, never tested it before, 500 subcontractors, and they used waterfall at that time, right? And so more and more of these, all digital service teams that I look, use Agile, splitting up a huge project into incremental, smaller steps, revisiting them, have everyone in this, have these sprints that also Marijn talked about, and have everyone on board at the same time. So hear all voices while you're designing or implementing, right? So yeah, I'm a big fan of Agile, obviously, but we've seen too many failures, I think, in the other ways, right? But the big challenge here is we need to write requirements for IT service providers or consultants already in that way, right? So have those, so providers have to be willing to also work in that way, otherwise you go back to the old ways. Yeah.
Hello. How do you measure the quality of the output in in all stages of co-creation? Like, how can that be? Yeah.
That's a really tough challenge. So our goal here was to understand what is the value that is created in each of the stages, and we used a very grounded theory-like approach because we wanted our interview partners to tell us what they see as value and what they observe, right? Instead of giving them categories, this is how we measure it, so can you check the boxes? Because the reality is very different than what the theory says. And there are 105 different public values in the literature, and it's impossible, in my point of view, to measure them. This is for our case, right? You might come up with a very different research design. You're a student, right? Yeah, so you might be very interested in has user satisfaction increased or not. There are also simple measures like, are more people moving from analog into digital? So are we actually serving more people than before? And then to what extent potentially, right? So those are some of the traditional measures, and ours were really focusing on what do these units think they're delivering right now, and what are they adding to? But now others need to operationalize this and then maybe send out surveys to citizens or also other users.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to thank you. I think it was an extremely interesting topic, and I really like the approach. I think it's very interesting. What I wanted to ask you is, because here basically we are. It's a general question about co-production that. Citizens from being simply like consumers, now we are giving them a real role. And I think this is it has some implications also on the way, in a certain way government works, The government is typically used to a very, top to bottom approach. And this is really a big shift, I think, If we were to do this for, every project, this would be a really also cultural shift of, having a ministry which maybe it's not the one who is, 100% in charge of everything, can take every decision, but really it's a co-produced, environment. So I was just thinking of how you think this, let's say, affects also in a societal way, the way, government works.
Yeah, that's why I brought up these different types of values, and we made these 4 different categories of values. Because we are in a time where there's lots of populism, right? People are completely angry, they want to scale down government even more, and civil servants are really trying their best with the same type of resources that they have before to cater to an ever more complex world. So I think this is a perfect approach to kind of bring in people so early that they had a word and they can say something. And so that's the kind of societal value that we are also creating, that we are creating public services that citizens are willing and have fun to use, in the same way that you would go on Amazon or Twitter. It's easy, it's transparent, well, Twitter not, but Amazon is relatively transparent in the way that they deliver services, right? I'm not saying government should be like Amazon, but think about the simplicity of how the service is delivered. So that's, it's one of the things. I think many governments, the national governments, have those units. Lots of them are popping up now. You heard 2 of them talk here. There are many more here in the room, 2 or 3 more. For them, it's very natural. They are big fans of this. What's not so natural is in the head of the public managers. So those who are in charge of then defending this to a city council, for example, because there's at least in some bureaucracies, if you're at a certain level in government, then you're allowed to talk to the public on behalf of the agency. But now you're giving that responsibility to project members, right? To kind of the lowest potentially civil servants who are many different pay grades below you. And if you're working cross-functional teams and in an agile way, decisions are made by those teams, including the input from the citizens, right? And now we need to empower public managers to also go out and say, yes, I stand behind those teams and the decisions that they have made, and this is a good thing. So I think our challenge is to bring in top-level management to support this, right?
Thank you very much. I see there are now a lot of other questions, but you will be here during the break, so you can approach it. So I'm sorry about that we have to stop this question round. Now I would like to give the floor to my dear colleague Vassilis, I'm sorry. So it is with pleasure I would like to introduce you Vassilis Kouliolas, who is director and founder of eGovlab, an applied research institution at the Stockholm University, Department of Computer Science. eGovlab is a unique government testbed focusing on public sector transformation towards future service delivery. As a social entrepreneur, technologist and mentor, Vassilis has dedicated over 2 decades to improve good governance while bridging the gap between citizens, local communities and policy makers. In addition, he serves as the program chair of the International Council for Information Technology in Government Administration. And he is very important to mention, he's also very active in Africa, in Botswana in particular. I really look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Well, this time around, you will not see a presentation, but I do have some notes just to sort of guide something. So we could actually put a picture of an elephant there, because since we've been talking about elephants, whether it is white or black, I prefer black ones, so which are the normal ones. And what I wanted to discuss with you is some of the experience with respect to digital transformation. I work in Sweden, and eGovlab is pretty much an innovation lab, whatever you want to call it, but we deal with societal challenges. So, and of course, we're governed by, we're part of the public sector, and so we're governed very often with what the political agendas are, and this is something that we cannot really neglect. So, if we're looking at the food chain, we have to sort of sift our minds of what the food chain means and try to digitize that whole sector, or if we're talking about citizen participation and citizen engagement and so on. But this is enough. I mean, Sweden is one of the top 5 countries in digitization around the world, and you know, in many events that I usually appear, there's somebody in the audience that will say, what about Africa? Okay, so let's take all these digitization ideas and head down to our origins, where we all come from. And our origins, actually, from what I found out a few weeks ago, are from Botswana. So in some pens called the Makarikari pens, which is a fantastic area, many elephants there. So they have a population, actually, of 158,000 elephants that they live in that area. So I've been working in Botswana for a while, and one of the areas that I really enjoy is understanding the cultural roots of democracy. So I come from a place where supposedly democracy was born, as tyranny was born as well, and various other things, and which is in Athens. And I come to find out when I arrived in Botswana that they have been practicing these democratic models for a few thousand years. You know, traditional democracy, tribal democracy. So they just have a baobab tree, and they have some stones around it. Has anyone been to Botswana from here, by the way? We have a couple of hands. Good. So you know what the hotla is? So they put some stones around this baobab tree, and they all gather up in the village, and they discuss all of the issues. So they try to resolve them internally. Well, public service delivery, right? And very often you have some innovative ideas that come out of all of these discussions. So looking at this, then I thought, many things happen and different tribes. And one of the tribes from the UK that is now trying to leave European Union came over and they made it a protectorate. So they brought in new forms of government. So these new forms of government, which is representative democracy, sort of clashes a little bit with traditional democracy. But aren't we all tribes anyhow, at the end of the day? So we have our own little clans and we do our own little things, as they're doing there in a more traditional way. Now, with bringing this representative democracy, it sort of alienated the decision-making process that was usually around that baobab tree and between the stones, where everyone has the same right to say anything, whether you are a child, a woman, an elder, whatever, or youth. So this new form of governance totally shifted the decisions into Gaborone, which is the capital now of Botswana, and it alienated a lot of the tribes. So we thought, let's digitize that process. Let's go ahead and, what do people use? They use mobile phones over there. They have smartphones. So we created a digitized process. This is the digital hotla, if you call it. So all of the citizens actually still keep meeting underneath that tree. And they provide their consensus back to the government in Gaborone. Now, a few things about Botswana. Botswana, for the ones that haven't been there, it's a little bit bigger than France, with a population of Latvia. So there are about 2.2 million people. But most of them are concentrated in the capital and a few other cities, but connectivity is fantastic. They have put in fiber all over the place, and broadband connectivity is there, and most of the people have smartphones. So they really engage in the political discourse and a lot of the services. Now, from the economy perspective, you have it is based on diamonds. So there are a lot of connections with Antwerp and Gaborone, and the public sector. So going back to our first presenter of this session, that there is no public service, public sector innovation. Well, often, if 85% of all of your economy is the public sector, then you have to have some kind of innovation. And a lot of our innovations came from the public sector. The wireless that you are using today, it was used back in the 70s in the United States. When a ship would go to port, they would send a wireless signal, so they would prepare everything for logistical purposes so they can move out. Well, this is what the wireless that we're using today is based on that. So it did come from the public sector. So you have, depending on the governance model that you are using, Botswana happens to be a social welfare state modeled out of Sweden and supported during the revolution from Cuba and Moscow. It just has kept a lot of these political affiliations. So the question is now, how do we move towards public sector innovation in Botswana? And the president of Botswana, that was recently elected, he said, we want to move from a mining-based economy into a knowledge-based economy. So, so they came, I mean, since I've been working with them, he came over and he said, Vassili, why don't you take this digitization sector and see how we can shift Botswana towards a knowledge-based economy. This is when I lost a big part of my hair in the back, if you've noticed. So where do you start? Okay, so I had to go back on everything I have been working on so far in Sweden and in the lab, and just head to the moon and start and see what is going on. How do you actually shift a mining-based economy into a knowledge-based economy? So especially with a population of 2.2 million, so you don't really have the depth, you don't have the internal market to build things, and then you need to start looking at the region. So if you go to a place in Botswana and look at 1,000 kilometer radius, all of a sudden from 2.2 million you have close to 80 million, which is a little bit better market to move your goods and services in a knowledge-based economy. Then, you know, in the knowledge-based economy, you have three different tracks. One of it is industrializing, digitizing your industry. Okay, and in Botswana, there's a lot of mining going on, and there's some tourism industry that is quite interesting. And so you need to digitize your industry, you need to digitize your public sector. And then you need to make sure that no one falls behind. So you need to have a nation that needs to also be literate about digitization and what that means, and start creating on all of this. So the first thing, so everything now is on the plans. He just got elected, and we have this national transformation team, and we're all meeting to see how we're going to move to knowledge-based economy. So, but there are some things that are actually interesting that are coming out, because the beauty is that we don't have to start from scratch. Okay, we already know some of the most digitized nations. For example, Singapore has done. So they went directly to the cloud, so you don't need to build a lot of data centers and do whatever. Then you have some standards that have already been built, so you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Then we know very well about co-creation and of services. So we are starting to put all of these elements together. And we have created there was a very interesting innovation hub, as they called it, that was mainly used as a real estate service. So there were a lot of new companies in there, wonderful, fully connected, and so on, that were actually shifting it now into a digital innovation hub for public service transformation. They've selected 6 services that will be rolled out next year. One of them is electronic procurement, which is a total mess over there. It's very segmented. A lot of the ministries, they are in silos, so the good old stories that we know from most of you know, the developed world as well. So, so you have electronic procurement. We will look at all registries as another one of the pillars, which is passports, electronic identity, land registration. Then we will look at electronic payments to government, and keep in mind everything now in mobile. So everything will be based on a mobile phone, because this is where most of the population communicates with. And then we will look at driver's licenses and license registration. So, but what does it take to do that? It does take leadership. It does take, from the political environment, someone to say, this is what we're doing, and all you ministers are going to follow along, because I said so. So it takes the president actually to spearhead an effort like this, because these silos, and they have had a lot of the public workers that have been there for quite a long time, and often they're not digitally ready, and they like paperwork. Then I looked at some of the data that is required for storage capacity on the cloud. You can take a whole ministry and put all the data in 2 terabytes. So really, you can have 2 mobile phones and have the whole ministry in there. So why do you really need big data centers? So what we're looking at now is connecting everyone. So priority number 1 is to connect everyone at the most remote village. Promote the culture and the arts. So this, we're talking about now digital innovation in what is the obvious. So bringing about the culture and the arts, good governance models, because industrializing digital, it is key, because you create new forms of business propositions from there. So this is the whole idea, and one of the key areas that we need to talk about is actually the security. How secure are the places we're working with? And when we're talking about open data and digital innovation, we need to also make sure of who owns that data. We do have, as we know, the infrastructure that is owned by a few with a lot of interests, and the data is within that infrastructure. And then from that data, you build information, and then you build knowledge, and this is where your citizens sit. But if you look all the way down, they all go through some pipelines from there, of fiber. So who owns that? And this is a key governance model throughout, because it is not only about one nation that is moving data and accessing data. Everyone is in there, in a digitized world. So this is the experience of that white elephant in Botswana. There's still a lot to be seen, but it's quite interesting, and I figured, it may be a good idea, since I just came over 2 days ago, to sort of tell you my experience about digital innovation in some of the most non-obvious spots of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk and food for thought. Are there some questions? Everybody's desperate for lunch.
Aha.
Yeah.
Miguel, all the way to the back.
Vassilis, very, very inspiring presentation from your side for a very unknown country, at least to me. In Africa, this is good news. I just have, out of my curiosity, you mentioned that e-procurement is one of the first domains to be digitalized. The question is, I can imagine that in those countries, in Europe, certainly we have corruption in some cases, but in those countries there must be high levels of corruption. How this digitalization is tackling corruption on e-procurement?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Yes, corruption is apparent everywhere within Africa and in Europe and in many other places. But the idea is that we're partnering with open contracting partnership. I don't know if some of you might be familiar with that. So there are some frameworks where you make all procurement transparent, as we have here. So, this is one way to sort of tackle the big issue of corruption, is to make procurement fully open and transparent and competitive to everyone, because it costs a lot of money to government. So another thing that it is key, we, not only in Europe, but around the world, we need to look very closely at the developments in Africa, because they affect us all. We see this on a daily basis in some of the bordering countries. But as we are moving forward, by 2050, Nigeria would be the third largest country in the world, and DRC, along with Ethiopia, they will be in the top 10. So if we are not really trying to put our efforts in partnering with our African partners in the development of this, we may be facing a lot of societal issues, not only here, but there as well.
Other questions? If not, thank you very much. Thank you.